Well, it's my honor to introduce our next speaker, a native of Arkansas. Randy was raised on a farm in Arkansas County, and he graduated from the State College of Arkansas with a bachelor's degree in biology. 30 years leadership management career with the Arkansas Department of Parks and Tourism. He's a graduate of the LEAD Arkansas class of 2 and became nationally recognized as a motivational speaker on subjects of leadership, communication skills, dealing with change. Randy is a professional member of the National Speakers Association since 2006 and has spoken in over 40 states. And he's president of his own company listed there, Leadership Takes Courage. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker then, Randy Frazier. We're going to do this via a video, and then we've got Randy on the other end to answer questions.
Greetings and welcome from Wild Mountain, Arkansas. As has been widely rumored, my name is Randy Frazier. Although my government career has been many years in the past, I am here to help you be a better public speaker. Let me say on the onset, we have some things in common. And years ago, I completed a 30-year career in conservation education. I'd also say that over 50 years ago, I started my involvement in public speaking. I literally started in high school. So it's not much of an exaggeration to say I feel like I've been in training for over half my life to speak on this subject to this audience. I'll add to that, as we go through this material, that in the last couple of decades, I've dedicated to leadership development. And I see a very strong connection between being an effective communicator and being an effective leader. So you may very well come across some of the material in this is saying, well, that sounds like it's really about leadership, but I find the two subjects go hand in hand. Speaking from the front of the room means that you have become the thought leader in that room. So let's dive in. As the late, great Jerry Reed said in his song, we've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. And I'm going to start in just a moment by asking you two questions. I will precede that by asking you of a favor. You've probably already taken care of this, but you need to have a pencil or pen and piece of paper, because as I ask these two questions, your answer to each one should be written down. And it'll be a number, just a number. I promise this is not going to be an essay type thing. I'll just ask the question, you write down a number. Don't worry, it's not a math problem, thank goodness. This is just a number that answers each of these first two questions. The other thing I'll ask you to do on the onset is to locate yourself a dime, your pocket or someone else's. If you can't find a dime, a penny or a nickel or a quarter will do. If you absolutely cannot find any change, take a paper clip or something like that. But the dime really works great. And we'll do something with that in a few minutes that will help make a point and you'll remember it. And so just take your dime or whatever you've got there and lay it on the desktop. Here we go. Question number one. How many speeches have you heard in your life? And I don't expect you to go to the file cabinet and do research on that. I just want you to answer that from the gut. And you can start from the time you say you even got out of high school. So you might want to put a range down there. No one's going to check your numbers, but just stop and assess for a moment. How many speeches have you heard in your life? Not to give the answer away, but most people come up with a number somewhere in the range of thousands. Question number two, are you ready? How many of those do you remember? Kind of an awkward question, isn't it? Especially if I were to press you on your answer, because in times past I have pressed people on that answer, and they usually shrink the number down from saying, well, dozens to, well, maybe a handful. If I were to ask you how many speeches you've heard in the past that you have a fairly vivid recollection of, what was the point of that speech? How did it start and how did it end? And how did they tie those two ends together? The truth of the matter is, most folks, if they're painfully honest, the number shrinks down to below 5. Well, you don't have to answer this question, just contemplate. Why is that we hear hundreds and hundreds and thousands of speeches, but 10 years later, we very seldom remember the point that was being made. The rule of 10 says that 10 days after presentation, there's usually not more than 10% of the audience who remembers more than 10% of what was said. And that raises this third rhetorical question that you don't have to write down an answer for, and that is to pose the question, how does a good speaker, and frankly, I'm going to start with the premise, you're already a good speaker. How does a good speaker become a great speaker? And because I have dealt with professional speakers for a large part of my life, I will tell you that most of the professional speakers I know will say that the best speakers are the ones who make the best use of best practices. Pretty safe answer. And because I believe that's a true, good answer, in the next short period of time, and I'm going to tell you that what we're going to cover is more like a workshop training session than a speech. And because of that, because of time restrictions, I'm going to move through some material pretty quickly. The offset is this will be archived and you can pull it up for reference later. So if it seems like I'm going fast, it's because I'm going fast. I want to help you get out of that box. In fact, literally, I think at the end of this, you will have the materials to absorb most of the best practices and become a great public speaker. And one of the things that you'll notice, and this is where we segue into this idea of leadership a little bit, is the best speakers also have the ability to make their concepts contagious. You see, the things that you remember from 10 years ago, it's because that they hit a place in your brain that you couldn't help but remember what was being covered. John C. Maxwell, not only a great speaker, but a tremendous leadership expert. He's written a number of books. A few years ago, hit a home run with a short quote. I think quotes are important. His quote distilled enormous amounts of experience and wisdom into such a short thing. He said, leadership is, one word, influence. Nothing more, nothing less. And as I have analyzed that and absorbed it over the years, I'll tell you, that's not just a home run, that's probably a grand slam. Because you see, if you're speaking from the front of the room, it's all about influencing what people are thinking and feeling, and more importantly, doing after they hear you speak. Now, if you think in terms of influence and you think in terms of leadership, as you study the subject, the book's going to come up, Leadership Challenge, written by two gentlemen, Kouzes and Posner, and they are sort of world-class experts. They've done the research with tens of thousands of interviews, asking people, what is it that would make you be influenced by a person enough to follow after them? And essentially, as I understand and absorb their material, it comes down to four top qualities. There are hundreds of other qualities about this that help you have influence, but they say that four things come to the top: honesty and integrity, being a person who is looking forward, as the late Wayne Gretzky said in hockey, I skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is. A person who is able to communicate those things well, their honesty, their integrity, their vision for the future, and lastly, their just genuine competence in being able to pull all those things together. As I worked on this presentation that I was asked to make, I just woke up one night with a person on my mind. Literally, that's how your brain works. And that person was Walter Cronkite. Now, he's the journalist extraordinaire from an earlier generation. Many of you listening, like myself, will remember him. Some you've just heard of him, but millions of Americans listen to him every weekday night on CBS Give the News. What made him such an influence on the American mind? Well, I just challenge you sometime, type in Google, most trusted man in America. And tell me if you don't see picture after picture of Walter Cronkite come up, because in a poll nationwide, that's the person that Americans said we trust the most trusted man in America. And not only that, but like as you add those things up, he ended every broadcast by saying, and that's the way it is. He didn't say that's the way it was. He says that's the way it is right now. And you knew tomorrow he would have already spent many hours preparing because he was looking then at what was going to happen over there. He had a vision. He helped people realize that it's not just chaos, there's a cosmos, and we're going to move toward that. And of course, he was the paramount communicator at the microphone. He was the professional speaker, extremely competent, and you knew he had competent people out there gathering the news. He had so much influence. We won't go off into it for time's sake, but just read sometime about how the Vietnam War was portrayed toward its end by Walter Cronkite, and why LBJ said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost mid-America. See, that's influence from a public speaker. That said, let's just dive a little bit further in about the idea of how do you make a concept contagious, and how do you get people connected with something that they really believe in. And I'm surprised that there's not been more said about this point. I've not heard anyone else make this comment, but you know, in the year 2020, the top news story is going to have to be the pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, a form of influenza. Did you know that we get the word flu, of course, from influenza, but that the word influenza comes from an Italian word, influenza. And so you go back into the 1700s when there was a huge outbreak of the flu in Italy, and they literally didn't understand contagion and germs and all this. They knew that people were getting it one from another to another to another. They thought perhaps it started with an influence from astrological arrangements that was flowing in, influenza, into people, and then from them to other people. And that's where we got the word influenza. Now, you see the connection, I'm sure. You see, influenza succeeds by infecting other people. We get the word influence from influenza, and it succeeds by affecting other people. When you speak from the front of the room, when you're the thought leader, you are affecting how people think. So let's push back now and look at the big stage of life. And I don't want you to panic, because I'm going to go over big chunks, segments of the process of being an effective influencer, and think, well, he's just not getting down into the nuts and bolts. I am going to get into the nuts and bolts, but after we put together the framework, and then we'll go back to each piece and pull back some layers so that we can get into more detail. So let's say that this is you on the right and someone else there on the left, and it has to start with the basic idea, the mission, if you will, of what it is that needs to be communicated to that other person. And as you dwell on that, it has to go from out there to in here. And you have to develop, to be a really effective speaker on that day, that subject, you have to develop what I call the saturated mind. I mean, you have to have researched it well enough that you have the comfortable confidence that you are the expert in the room, that you may not have all the answers, but you have looked for most of the answers and are still looking for the rest of the answers. The supersaturated mind. This is where, by the way, the work really happens in your head after you take the idea and you think about it, and we're going to develop that a little further. But let's say you've got the saturated mind, and now it's the time to put it out there. And that may be visually, auditorily, preferably both. That is the D-Day. If you've done due diligence, those stimuli go into that person's eyes and ears and amazingly changes their brain. Isn't it strange that when we're making fun of something, we say, well, you know, it's not brain surgery. Public speaking is brain surgery. It literally is. We now know at a microscopic level, when you change someone's mind, you literally change the physicality of their brain. And if you've done an effective job of communicating this idea, and a persuasive job of communicating this idea, literally at a microscopic level, the dendritic ends of the neurons in that other person's brains start to recalibrate and reorientate their neuron pattern so that they can conceive of what you have affected them with, right? So literally, it is nano-neurosurgery that you're doing in that other person's brain. And let's say that you have absorbed the best practices of being able to persuade people of what you're saying. Now you have amplified your influence. Isn't that amazing? Because you see, you're really not, as a speaking from the front of the room person, speaking to a person, you're speaking to a room full of people. And as a prospective leader who's going to grow and develop as a leader, you will consistently find yourself more and more at the front of the room, being the thought leader, and you will be doing brain surgery on more and more people. You are quite literally forming a relationship with each person that hears you present. Just a point, you see, leadership is relationship. Thought leading is relationship. And you may not be able, you will not be able to have a personal relationship with all of those people who hear you consistently give message after message after message, but they will have a relationship with you, just like I had a relationship with Walter Cronkite. I don't think he ever kind of got around to having time to look me up and ask me a lot of questions and know about me and my family, but I had a relationship with him, one of trust, one of knowing that he knew more than I did about where the world was and where it was headed, and that he could communicate it really well. Leadership is relationship. Now, as we delve into this ability to recognize there are skill sets that you need in order to be an excellent communicator, I need to pause for a moment and address what's known as the Pareto Principle, or the 80-20 rule, you may have heard it called. This is basically saying that all the best practices are not created equal. There's the best of the best practices, and there's the rest of the best practices. And according to the 80-20 rule, we will spend most of our time talking about the best of the best practices. The 80-20 rule basically, as it was discovered by Pareto, who was like a macroeconomist, he said, you know what, 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort. He literally found, we call them bean counters, you know, accountants. He counted peas and he discovered that 80% of his pea harvest came from 20% of the pods. How about that? He needed a job, didn't he? Well, truth of the matter is, he discovered on average, not a hard break point 80-20, but on average, 80% of the land is owned by about 20% of the people, 80% of the taxes paid by about 20% of the people. If you are in business, you probably have noticed about 80% of the profits come from 20% of the product line. And 20% of the sales force will make about 80% of the sales. And it just goes on and on and on and on. 80% of your personnel problems come from about 20% of your employees. You get the point. Not all best practices are created equal. So we're going to talk about the best of the best practices first, but we're not going to ignore the rest of the best practices because those are important to become a great public speaker. But 80% of the best results will come from 80% of the effort. I'd like to put a visual image in your head of this. Look at that graduated cylinder. If what I'm saying is correct, and I think you'll verify it with your own experience, if you take the best of best practices, the top 20% of best practices, you will be better than the average speaker every time you step up on the podium and get to the microphone. So we're going to spend 80% of our time on the most important 20% of best practices. We will not ignore the other 80% of best practices. We just want you to be clear on the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of books out there that talk about public speaking. And a lot of them spend a lot of time on that top 80%. Read all of them if you get a chance, okay? I've read a lot of them. And I'm not going to diss the 80%. You have to get better than just better than average to be a great speaker. And so you will need that other 80%. I'm just saying we'll spend most of our time on the 20%, and then we'll involve later the layers of the 80%. So what happens if you add the other 80%, well, you go from being much, much better than average to being a great speaker. I want you to notice in the graduated cylinder, as you get closer to the top, it starts getting a lot murkier. And that's the way it is, because that other 80% of best practices, what works for you may not work for me, and vice versa. So you get into personality differences and what works for you. You will find yourself as you move further and further into that territory, but you will not be able to deviate from that first 20%. To make that point even clearer, if you think that you can be an expert in all the nuances and forget that most critical best of the best practices, let's say I could do the impossible and put a plug between the 20% and the 80%. And let's say I could take that, we used to call those Arkansas credit cards, that siphon hose, and siphon out the best of the best practices. Your speech will not be a good speech. So we've made the point. We're going to first talk about that 20% that's the best of the best practices. And we're going to talk about 5 stages in the development of being a great public speaker. And these are the first 3. We'll label them. Again, this is framework. We'll come back and build the rest of the structure in just a moment. First part of the framework is the mission, the idea. It has to be extraordinarily clear. It will not be clear at first, but as you develop the saturated mind, it will become clearer and clearer. I love quotes, and again, I'm going to give you a wonderful quote. This is a Stephen Covey quote. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And 90% of the time, when a speech gets lost in the weeds, and we've all lost some speeches in the weeds, it's because the speaker somehow got away from the main point that they wanted to press into the audience's mind. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Really important. Number 2, this is where the work is really done. People say they dread giving a speech. If they've done much of it, what they really mean to say is they dread preparing for the speech. Wow. Nobody can tell you, even the best neuroscientists can tell you really how the brain does this. But the organizing is the part where the real work of the speech is done. It is the putting the points in order. What is organizing? It's the process of picking and placing the right points in the right order. Your brain is a sorting machine. It's a biocomputer, and if you put enough data in, it will start filtrating so that you can begin to see what are the hot points that are the most important points. And we'll make a clear point of that in just a moment. The day of relief is actually the day that you give the speech, because you see, if you've been so clear in your head of what the mission is and how those points should be organized, and we're going to get into that, how to organize those points, then this is the day when the fireworks go off. I mean, everything else is preparatory, but this is the day that you start doing nanoneurosurgery, if you will. This is when you're changing people's minds, literally their brains. All right, first 3 sections of this, we're going to shove to one side because the last half overlaps with the end of the first half. You see, in the delivery, and the first 20% is you have to have that delivery practice, practice, practice. Now there are many nuances, and now you start getting into more of the 80%. We're going to move from that in the large framework of this to the 4th section, and this is what separates amateurs from professionals. Most people get through the speech and, man, I won't have to do that again. Of course they will. What separates the ones who become great speakers is the evaluation. Now, it's very difficult to get evaluation feedback from a general keynote speech, but it's a lot easier if it's just in a workshop or if you're in another breakout type session. I literally use those type of feedback, anonymous things very, very frequently, every time I can. And when I can, I like to get it from a general speech. But if you're not getting feedback, and a particular type of feedback we're going to talk about in a moment, you're not going to get better. You can't fix what you can't find. And when it comes to your mistakes, you're blind. So you have to have someone else. And here again, this is the great quote from Ken Blanchard. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. Don't you see? That's just as true for leadership as it is being a thought leader and speaking from the front of the room. And then that fourth stage, absolutely essential. It's not enough just to have assessed and truly found out where your mistakes are. Then you have to bring in the person who's going to learn what those mistakes were and make the little tweaks, the little twitches, the little changes, and practice and put them in. You notice that toolbox is all about having the tools to adjust, 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 adjust. That's it. And it doesn't come together when I go through those 5 sessions like that. It will come together for you whenever I put them all on the same page. You see, this is what I teach in leadership too. This is what I teach in speech development, how to be a great speaker. You have to have a model. You have to have a framework. Frankly, I was in the martial arts. I was a defensive tactics instructor for a long time. And the question always comes, well, how many of these techniques do I need? Well, let me tell you, there are 1,000 techniques out there. But in the heat of battle, you have to have a clear idea of the fundamental things that you don't have to think about. You have to have that framework. And that's what I'm giving you. This is how you go from being good to great and developing as a public speaker and getting better at accomplishing things as a leader. You have a model. Now, I'm going to make that even clearer for you, because at this point, please pick up your dime or your nickel or your penny or your quarter. It doesn't work as good with a dollar bill. You know, it needs to be a coin, paper clip. Just pick it up. If you got a dime or whatever you got, I'd like for you to hold it up. And I want you to notice something. Unless you are different from the overwhelming majority of people in the world, you pretty much all did it the same way. You reached over and you put a finger, maybe 2 at the most, and you probably pulled it over to the edge. But to pick it up, you held it between one of those digits, first or second, maybe both, and your thumb. Your thumb. When I'm through this illustration, you're going to know this model like the back of your hand, I promise. Put your dime down now, because I'm going to tell you the reason you were able to pick it up. According to anthropologists, there are 3 big things that make us different as humans. That is our brain, our ability to communicate, and the human hand. We're not the only primate that has a thumb, an opposable digit, but we've got the best thumb, and that thumb is what made us so capable of making everything from a stone axe to an Apple computer. You have to have those digits, you see. And my point in telling you that is that I want to make very clear that the mission is absolutely essential, critical to being able to get to the end of the speech and make your concept contagious. You see, every time you pick something up, you hold it between those other digits and your thumb. Your thumb is the key digit on your hand. And so it is in developing a speech or developing a project, following anything in the model. You hold it up and you press it against the mission and you say, is this on mission? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing with the mission? We'll talk a lot more about that in board development, knowing what your mission is. So I would tell you, think in terms of the M as being the first digit. It's the most important. And again, a great quote from no less speaker than Peter Drucker. The first task of the leader is to find the mission. See how this connects between leadership and speaking from the front of the room? Know what it is you're trying to communicate from the front of the room. Be very clear. Peter Drucker says it's the first task. Number 2, where did I say the work is? This is the working finger, right? Think about that, the index finger. This is the organizing finger. This is the finger that represents picking and choosing, maybe thumping things out of the way. This is the finger you tap someone on the shoulder and say, I need your help. Incidentally, one of the most important phrases in leadership. I need your help. This is the finger, and I make no excuses for being raised as a rural South farm boy. It's your trigger finger. It's the finger that does the work. It's the finger that you depend on most, particularly when you're picking something up. You hold it between the organization of it and the mission of it and say, that's on mission. Next point, and yes, that is the tallest digit. When you hold your hand up this way, the tallest digit is the point of contact with the future. If you hold it this way and move it, it's the first part of you that makes contact with the outside world. It's the prominent digit. And no, I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to make the point. It's the tallest finger. It's delivery day. And you see, if you've done a great job with the mission and the organizing, the delivery is what other people see, but it's only because it's been put together by the index finger and the thumb. If you talk to piano teachers, they will tell you that the weakest finger on your hand is not your little finger. It's your ring finger. Isn't that interesting? Perfect analogy. You see the architecture of the hand follows the architecture of the model perfectly. We are wedded to the idea that we don't need to evaluate. We don't have time to evaluate. We've got the speech over with, for goodness sakes, mercy be. We are married to the concept that we're better than we really are. And that's why you have to be brutal in getting feedback, and a specific type of feedback that we'll talk about in just a moment. So you have to have the evaluation, and the evaluation is absolutely worthless to you unless you do something about it. And that's where the little finger, those little bitty details, that's in that 80% range, right? Because if you got the 20%, you'll always be better than the average speaker. But now, if you learn to evaluate and you learn to actually go in and tweak, make the changes in the script, make the changes in the slide. Now, let's go through and peel back some layers on each step of the model. When I began to work on this presentation, I started down one road and had to change roads, because I started down the road of saying, you know, think of your mission as the start of the building, the foundation, and you're going to build the building, have them live in it. And then I had an epiphany, and that was wrong. A better way to think about the mission and everything that follows the mission is it's not a building for them to live in. You're building something that's going to live in them. Really, you're doing something more like composing a song. And remember, you remember a lot of songs because they connect with things emotionally as well as in the rest of your logical brain. So think in terms of your mission being more like you have worked on this so that it rhymes like a song. And to that, let me just add, your speech has to be a balance, I believe, between your head and your heart. If your speech is all about the head and it's just dry, people will not be too excited about it, guaranteed. They'll say, all fact, no heart. All hat, no cattle, you know. So what we have to do is remember there's a heart out there. People may not remember all the words you say, but they won't forget how you made them feel about those words. So it has to be a balance point. But now if you're all emotion and just crying all the time or just about laughter, they'll go away with the fluff and wonder where the facts were. So you have to balance heart along with the head. Now your mission should be molded into the best ways that you can see that audience, that place, that time, that situation. And you're saying, hey, Frazier, I give a lot of speech. I can't do this for all of them. Really? Well, which speeches are important for you? How you will play the way you practice. And every speech is practice for playing the rest of the game. So you have your mission. You're going to focus on clarity. You know, I put Albert's picture here, but a lot of scientists get credit for this statement. It's really the idea of being able to condense all of what you're trying to say into a simple sentence, at the most 2 sentences. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. That's kind of brutal, isn't it? Just one quick example. You know, I served on the Keep Arkansas Beautiful Commission whenever I ended my career with Arkansas government. And this was our mission statement. And after attending a number of commission meetings, I began to ask the question, who can recite from heart, what is our mission? And everybody could get to the essential 3 things, but no one was ever able to quote the mission. So after a lot of thought and hand wringing and an executive retreat, this was the new mission statement. And you know what? Everything in those few words is in that big. only except people can remember what's in that little. Clarity is essential to the mission. Now we're ready for the real hard part, right? The organizing. What are we going to do with all this data? Where are we going to get all this data? How are we going to sort it together? And the answer there is, again, the brain. The human brain is able to feed if you give it food. And you have to give it the food. You have to give it the data points. You do have to do the Googling and do the research. You've got lots of books, cutting edge periodicals. Most importantly is talking to other people, tapping them on the shoulder. And you always want to talk to people who have the other side as their viewpoint, because you don't want to get up there and not know what they think. That will modify how you go about doing that. So you talk to people, you do the research, you put the data in there, and the thing that you're always looking for are the stories. Now, many of your questions came in saying, how do we engage? How do we engage? How do we keep them engaged? The simplest answer is the story, the story, the story. And if you listen to great speakers and great speeches, they personify the ability to put you in a time and place and tell a story. And some of the best speeches you'll hear are people who just start off by saying, let me tell you a story. And if you don't think stories are effective, go look at the stock for Netflix or any of those other streaming services. We want to be educated in an entertaining way and inspired through that story. The stories are absolutely essential. When you find all the data points, when you find the key stories, the conversations, this is what you do with them. 50 years ago, Dale Carnegie, when I was reading How to Win Friends and Influence People Through Public Speaking, said use envelopes and write them down. No. What you do is you email them to yourself. You just take a moment and pick up that phone and you send that note or that reference point or that website or that person, and you email it to yourself with a filterable word in the subject line. Now, when you get back home and you're ready to coalesce, you can search and you'll have all those points right there anywhere in the world that you can get your email. Just a little tip to help you organize that. Now you've got the data points and it looks like a mess, a hot mess. It looks like this big pile of Post-it notes. And again, your brain comes to the rescue. The more you digest, the more you sleep about it, literally, and think about it and talk with other people, your brain will start picking out the brighter, hotter points. And your speech will be judged. The quality of your speech will be a factor of how many really good things you had to edit out because you didn't have time to include them. And when you do that, you will have the beginning of the architecture of your speech, because you've had to take out everything that you couldn't put in but you'd like to put in, and that architecture basically becomes a block outline. Let's talk about the block outline. We won't have the time to spend as much as we'd like, but there's three parts, right? The grabber, the gripper, and the grower. Now, before we go on to the grower, let me just say a word about the grabber, because a lot of you have a lot of questions. How do we start? The story, the story, the story. But there's a dozen other great ways. Some of the most effective speeches start with a long pause, and then lean forward to the mic and whisper, I wish you could have been there. Another long pause. You've got them. Where? What? Tell me. Or you just start by saying, let me tell you a story, or let me paint you a picture. Here's a great opening. I need to ask you a question. Long pause. Now you've pulled them in. Now you've complimented them because you care about what they think and you want them to think. You've got to engage them. There are only 365 days in the year. Many significant events have happened on every day of the year. Go to this day in history. And if you're just the least bit clever, you can find some really amazing fact of what happened so many years ago on this day in history, and start by saying, probably not many of you woke up this morning and realized, boom, this Krakatoa erupted, or the Emancipation Proclamation was signed on this day. You see, we don't think about that, but we are impressed when other people, and then they segue got to segue well from that to the significant. And you have to make the connection of going from that thing that grabs them to the thing that's going to grip them. Now, when you grip, you notice I say they have to like you. You smile right from the start. Don't get up and scowl at them. You start by smiling, and then you, let me tell you a story. And then you grip them with the progression of stories. Don't lose them in data. Tell them the story. And then the last part, of course, the grabber, the gripper, and you call to action because you're a thought leader, you're a leader. So now you've got the grabber, the gripper, and what do? Watch commercials on TV, for goodness sakes. Commercials start by telling you there's a problem and I've got a solution. Got a problem, here's a solution. They tell you what the problem is, and then they give you the solution. That's what you do with the speech. They've got to know that you're there to help them solve a problem in their life, not your life, in their life. Someone said once, if you have a keynote that's not solving a problem, you don't have a keynote. So you have to start with a problem. Now, if you're doing the same speech many times, I would advise that you learn something about mind maps. We do not have the time to talk about how to develop mind maps. Go to Google. Information about that's all over the book. If you email me, mail@randyfrazier.com, I'll email you a set of references and some books that will help you. I will take long enough to show you an example, just so if you're not familiar with mind maps. This is one I put together for a speech that I've done many times called What I've Learned from 9,000 Years of Farming. It's an entertainment but inspiration type speech, see? And so I start with a focal right in the middle, and then your brain remembers images much better than it does words and numbers. So as you build your map, and in my case, we literally get in the time machine and we go from the first farm and the causes of why farmers are like they are and ranchers to the last part of the Frazier farm in the early part of the 20th century. And then the key point you see is revolving around that center, the little musical interlude, and then down at the bottom, the critical answer to the question is, why is there hope for the future for farming and ranching? And so you pull it all together in one thing. All right, so that's mind mapping. Now we're ready to move forward in organizing for a straightforward speech. This will surprise many of you, but Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, did not speak off the cuff. You notice it says practiced order. He practiced all his speeches. He made an enormous fortune many times and lost it in bad investments. You know how he made it back? Public speaking. And people thought he was so witty and so clever, he spoke off the cuff. No. This is something that he wrote, and he didn't write this just to be funny. It usually takes me 3 weeks to prepare an impromptu speech. Big shock, huh? He had it so well inside that it came out as if it was just off the top of his head. That's what you want. What Voskamp said, and thank you for writing your book, practice is the hardest part of learning. If you're not willing to practice, it won't work. Training is the essence of transformation. This is hard work. And now you get to the delivery, and the delivery is going to be easy because you've got the mission clear, you've done your research, boom, this is the fireworks. Moving into the 80% realm, I will also add there are some minefields out there before you try to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Avoid ethnocentricity. 25-cent word, simple meaning. Do not act, talk, and think like everyone in the room looks like, acts like, thinks like you do. That's incidentally the reason all these figures are very androgynous, red and gray entities, you see. You've got to be able to identify, not vilify anyone in the audience. Don't use dog whistle words. Dear old George Bush, when he gave his speech and said after 9/11, join us in a crusade against jihadists, the Muslim world only heard the word crusade, and that means something totally different to them. And you have to practice in order to keep things in the package that you've got. So now, very quickly, you will have AV problems. Anticipate them. Get there the day before, check out everything, make friends with the IT person, and anticipate. When you get 500 people in the auditorium, radio wave frequency changes. So you need to allow for that and practice that. and treat the microphone like your friend, for goodness sake. Learn how to use the microphone. And the best speakers and all the best singers make love to the microphone. You know that line in the Billy Joel song, the piano man and the microphone smell like a beer? That's why you can whisper if you know how to use the microphone. Pack your PFD. That's the little index card that has the block outline. You won't need it, but you'll feel better that you've got it there in front of you. And then you tell your story. And I love what Steve Jobs said. This is why I always go back, tell the story, tell the story. The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda. Is there anything any more important for an entire generation to come? When you put all those things together, the mission, the organizing, the delivery, guess what? You're going to be better than average, but we've mostly just covered the 20% and a little bit of the 80%. What are the last things you've got to do? Well, evaluate. Another billionaire speaks to us. Bill Gates says your most unhappy customers are your greatest source of learning. If you're not asking for anonymous evaluations, you're kidding yourself. Really, really. All your friends are going to say you did a great job. You have to find a way, maybe through one of your trusted friends, to send out the questionnaire to other people and assure them, hey, there's no negative consequences for telling me what I'm doing wrong. In fact, just send out the questionnaire through an anonymizer and say, I need you to tell me 3 things that will make this a better speech. Let them give it to the anonymizer, and the anonymizer give it to you. And make the little technique changes. Now we're deep into that 80%. You got to have made the speech about them. By the way, words, I like what Douglas Couplain said. He was an artist speaker. He said, words are like art supplies. You'll learn better how to pick out better words. Practice in front of the webcam. Just stand there and give your speech and then play it back. Play it back to other people and get their comments. Humor helps, but man, we could spend all day and not cover everything about humor. Go out and buy the Audible for Steve Martin's book, Born Standing Up, and it will open your eyes about the nuances and the intricacies of humor. Humor is so great, such a powerful tool. You can use it in many ways, or you can, like a sword, fall on it if you're not careful. So study the humor aspect and understand how you use that, and never use it against the audience. It's always about you. Get comfortable with engagement. If you do the things that we've been talking about, you will be comfortable. You'll be confident. You'll be the expert in the room, and then you'll be able to look them in the eye and not look down, not try to read something off the screen. For goodness sakes, be willing to put some pauses in there, because again, if you email me, mail@randyfrazier.com, I'll send you some quotes, and one of them you'll particularly like, from no less than Mark Twain, about how to plan a pause. Listen for tonality. Most of us sound much better when we lower the pitch of our voice and we're able to slow down. No, I've not slowed down during this because this is a training session. You can go back and get this. I have to cover this material. Eschew obfuscation. That's the funny way of saying, make it plain. Make things, don't use acronyms. Don't throw letters at your audience. You think they know. You think they think you'll know. Tell people what you're talking about. Always get clear. And for goodness sakes, don't do this. Anything that you put on a screen in a word should be no less than 24 points. Use as few words as you can, and do not read off of the screen. I mean, really, that tells them you don't know what you're doing. Now we're ready to say the mission. You've organized, you deliver, you evaluate, and bang, there it is. That's how you go from being a good speaker to being a great speaker. That's how you experience leadership, through the lens of public speaking. That's how you become an effective public speaker. You bring yourself out of this box that you've absorbed. And as my wonderful friend Ray Ledgerwood always says, leave them with 3 takeaways. Number 1, influence is everything. And I mean, it's not the only thing. I mean, everything you do influences your leadership. How you talk, how you walk, how you dress, how you address the audience. Influence is everything. And so think in terms of that when you speak. Number 2, use the model. You know, if there were an easier way to format a logical progression of how to build yourself as a better speaker or how to accomplish projects as a leader, you would have found it by now. Someone would have given it to you. You know this like the back of your hand, and I'm going to bet that 10 years from now, if asked, what was the main thing that I left you? You should be able to pick up a dime and say, you know, let me talk to you about MODEL. And then number 3, and I get my composure before I say this because I've not addressed this yet. The reason it's important for me, for you to be the best speaker from the front of the room, to be the best leader you can be, is that natural resources cannot vote. I had a 30-year career in conservation education, and one of the great leaders I've known was a guy named Richard Davies, who was the head of our agency. And early in my career, he was kind to me. He took me aside and he said, you know, Frazier, you're on fire to save the world. He said, I just want you to remember something. The natural resources don't vote. People vote. You need to get good at influencing the people who make the decisions. And so I leave you with the wonderful words of Baba Dion. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. And we will love only what we understand. And we will understand only what we are taught. You will be greater teachers yet than you are now. And I thank you for that. God bless you.
Our first question is going to be an easy one. So this is to both of you. Just a comment. This was an excellent presentation. So for both of you, and the way that you came about some of our questions that we had from our registration was fabulous. So let's go to what, Randy, this is first couple questions going to be from you. What is the name of your book that you referenced in Leadership is Influence Screen? What is the name of your book?
The mind map, I guess, is that what we're talking about? The book and the mind map? Well, I'm a little embarrassed to talk about my book. It's not about me talking about my book, but the name of the book grew out of doing a presentation many times about what you learn from 9,000 years of farming. And so that's the title of the book, What I Learned from 9,000 Years of Farming.
9,000 years of farming. And
what
they can,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. What I learned from 9,000 years of farming.
Yeah. I sleep in a hyperbaric chamber. I'm really, you know, I'm in my best face today. I'm pretty old, really.
And you're still working on your 9,000 years, right, Matt?
Yeah. I'm not finished yet. Although growing up on a farm will just about finish you off.
Okay. All right. So regarding Randy, one more question for you, and then we're going to switch to both of you. Regarding your advice on choosing words that aren't divisive, how do you vet the language to ensure you're not using trigger words? You mentioned trigger words during your presentation.
Yeah, those, and the classic term for that is dog whistle words. And that's what makes them so deadly. It's like the dog whistle. Most of the people don't even hear that pitch, but there will be a few people that you say just the wrong word, that word means something totally different. So my best recommendation to not get yourself blown up by that one or two people is to think through, and literally when I talk about practicing, I would recommend that you do a webcam of your presentation if it's a major one. And I know that most of your speeches are not in front of 500 people, but just practice and do that presentation. And if you do that and record it, like on Zoom, you have the benefit then of talking to the organizers of the event and say, you know, let me just let you see what I'm saying and tell me if I'm unnecessarily ruffling someone that I don't even know about. So I would, when possible, I would go ahead and vet that against the people on the inside of the organization. And if they're cool with it, then you're pretty safe because they're going to know where the minefields are. One of the things I talk about is that about the ethnocentricity thing is we are blind to it. We kind of tend to think everybody's like us, and that will get you in trouble, particularly these days. Everybody's not like you. You have to tell the truth, but do it in the way that will not turn them off. Turn them off.
So normally there's somebody that calls you or Matt and says, I want you to present on this or do a keynote or do this presentation. That's the person that you can rely on, or persons you can rely on for that vetting. You know, I've got this joke, or I got this idea, I got this something or other. You can actually run it by them then, huh?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh.
absolutely. And you know, if you've got time in advance, if it's a major speech, ask them, could I talk to some of your people and get some phone numbers, and just tell me some folks that I can, it's that using your index finger and tapping them on the shoulder, and tell me from your perspective, what are y'all dealing with?
Yeah.
And are there some, I just ask them sometimes, where are the kryptonite minefields that Superman does not want to go or walk delicately? They'll help you.
Right. All right. For both of you, then, the next question comes in. How do you handle detractors that interrupt you during the course of a presentation or public speaking engagement? Matt, let's start with you. How do you handle those detractors?
Well, I would hope that, you know, speaking with adult groups, it's probably pretty rare. I know back to my days of doing middle school assemblies, it was a little more of a challenge. But I would hope, you know, with adults speaking to adults, that you're not going to have examples of that, but certainly it could happen. If you've got someone that's, you know, being really disruptive, and maybe I'm doing a workshop where I can kind of work the room. You know, in the past, I would kind of, as you're walking around talking, kind of stand next to that person a little bit, and, you know, still speaking to the crowd, but you're next to them. You're letting them know that I'm aware of what you're doing, that I'm kind of standing with you, even putting your hand on their shoulder if they're being really disruptive. So, I mean, I think in dealing with student groups, that might be a little more of a challenge, with folks wanting to, you know, show off for their friends and all. And I think sometimes, I mean, that you could even pause and just stop and wait 5 seconds to see if the person stops, and then continue on. I mean, if it's really bad, you could walk over, you could even address it. But again, I would hope that's not going to be an issue that most people are going to be facing, but certainly, you know, depending on the topic and the crowd, it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Randy? Yeah.
let me offer a thought about that, because Matt's exactly right, that you've got to deal with whatever you got to deal. There is a formula, and at the risk of sounding like I use formulas, because one of the things I used to teach is customer service, and how do you deal with the angry customer. And so there's 3 words: feel, felt, and found. And if you can remember that little, it's easier: feel, felt, and found. And so if someone is so abrupt and rude as to stand up or shout or whatever, one approach is to just stop for a moment and say, excuse me, you know, I can tell that we need to visit more at length. What was your name? And so now they kind of have to self-identify, which they probably are fine with that. And so, well, let me just say, Jim, let's say their name is Jim, I understand how you feel. Long pause. He wasn't expecting that. The audience wasn't expecting that. But all of a sudden, you've kind of come across the line on his side just a little bit, because you're saying, I understand how you feel. And then the second word is, and the truth of the matter is, there's been times when I have felt that same way. Wow. Now I've identified, I'm acknowledging, I know how you feel. There's times when I have felt like that. And then here's where you turn it gently. Would that I could turn things as well as Matt Lohr. You turn it and say, let me share with you what I have found. Another long pause. Now you have to be thoughtful enough about how you're going to make that next line, but as Matt would say, you've kind of turned the subject just a little bit. So now you're speaking, and I have found that when you look at these issues a little more and go a little more in depth, that there are more than one side to this. And I would love to speak with you later after the session. And I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. Boom, I'm back into the speech. And it just kind of takes the wind out of their sail a little bit. And some of you who've been in sales and customer service recognize that feel, felt, and found will help you deal with some of those angry people.
Matt, I bet you've experienced that, haven't you? I mean, I can almost feel that question on a farm bill program coming at you like a zinger, right? And you have, on my farm, go ahead, Matt. Yeah, speak to that.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, there will be people, especially when you're rolling out a new program or you're trying to educate folks about a change that's taken place. Speaking with employees about a change that the administration has made, sometimes you get folks that they're not necessarily in favor. I think Randy's right. Being able to help them understand that you understand that their issue, you understand, you put yourself in their shoes, and then being able to say, let's talk, let's follow up, or kind of give your personal experience on that. So I think that's a great experience. And certainly back in my old political days, I remember many times having folks be able to want to steal the show and express their displeasure with some piece of legislation or something going on. So definitely those distractions can get you rattled. I think the final thing I would say is really just try to stay calm and not let it knock you off your game, because it's really easy in those situations to just get rattled and lose your concentration. But like Randy said, being able to come back around then and then be able just to continue moving ahead, it's going to take some practice, but certainly good advice.
It does.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks so much, guys. Now, the next question then is, if for no reason your nerves get the best of you and your voice cracks or you lose your breath, do you have any tips to get back on track? And let's start with you, Matt. You just all of a sudden your nerves get the best of you. You maybe have a little bit of anxiety pang or something, and you got to get back on, back on your game. Any tips?
Yeah, and it can happen. I mean, certainly if you've got a joke that you're delivering and it just bombs, I mean, those things can kind of start to rattle you a little bit. For one, and you mentioned earlier, for me, it's good to always have a glass of water. I think if you just pause, take a drink of water, just kind of calm yourself, because I know for me, if I ever get rattled, the first thing you feel is you get that dry mouth sitting in, and then it just kind of snowballs. So having a glass of water. But I think sometimes just being able to there's nothing wrong with just taking a breath and pausing and kind of collecting yourself, take that drink of water, and then continue. The more you speak and get up in front of a group, I promise you, the easier it's going to be. The hardest speech is always the first time you do it. And so I think the more experience and the more practice you have, those situations hopefully will happen less frequently. But yeah, just pausing, catching your breath, drink of water, I think are some good tips.
Randy, add to that?
What he said, that's really good. Sometimes if you take that drink of water, you can just look and say, whoever made that knew what they were doing. And it just kind of helps the audience. The audience really loves you, really. If nothing else, they feel empathetic or sympathetic toward you. And the overwhelming majority of people are going to be supportive of someone. And I would also say it's a little bit like, when you go to the circus and people are watching the person on the high wire act, and there's no net underneath there, the person up there doing the walking, they give every manifestation of being calm and what have you. But if the person up there begins to get real nervous and starts dropping their balance pole or whatever, all of a sudden the audience just, they absorb that nervousness, and then they get nervous for you, and then you're nervous because now they're nervous for you. So Matt's right. It's got to come from inside you that you're going to have that calm exterior. And again, he's right. The more you practice, the more you do this, the more you'll surprise yourself that you sound and look better than you thought you did. And you won't believe that until you go back and watch the videotape. So do that webcam practice, do your speech right. Whether it's a PC or a Mac, you can look right in there and record if you're doing slides and record yourself. And what a deal. And then you can play it back and see what it looks like, and you'll get better and better.
Thanks, guys. You know, I was asked, you know, in just the few presentations I give, Ray, what do you do for your nerves? I said, man, if I don't have a little bit of nervousness, right, then I'm not on my game. So a little bit of nervousness, even with the professionals, right? You got to have a little anxiety, a little bit, you know, worrying about stuff, right, to hit that podium and really deliver the best presentation and speech. So what about this? This is a key takeaways for conveying a message in this virtual format. And I know both of you are just getting started with this, as you've mentioned that to the audience already. Where should you focus to engage a virtual audience? What are your early thoughts on that as you're just getting kicked over to this new way of doing business?
Matt, you want to go first?
Well, so a little more clarification when you say where do you focus, like as far as the content of the presentation, or what specifically you think you're getting?
Yeah, the question was, where should you focus to engage a virtual audience?
Yeah.
Where should you?
Well, clearly I'm not very good at it, because I want to just reach out to the audience, to bring them in, and I can't. So I'm still learning this virtual game, and maybe I think Randy's had some more experience than I have, but let me just say it's tough, because you love the laughter and just there's just a connection you have with your audience when you're in front of the room, and it's hard. And so I think for me, we're all still learning. I think the more you do it, again, the more comfort you'll have. But gosh, I mean, I'm certainly not the expert to be giving advice on connecting with an audience through these virtual meetings, because I'm still figuring it out myself. But
yeah. Randy, any thoughts as you start to work this a little bit?
Yeah, the first thing I do, Ray, is hire you, because you're the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, and you have put it all together. And kudos to Mike for hiring you. Second thing is, you're always looking for that way to get them involved, and it is tougher in a virtual audience. So you do have to find ways to kind of pull them in. You notice one of the things that I did right off is I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and that's always a good thing, is to ask them a question, even if it's rhetorical, or ask them to do something. And of course, the dime helped me in a lot of different ways, because it made me get people a little, you had to dig into your pocket a little bit if you got a coin out. And I'll just give you another thing that just came to me last night. I was thinking about it, but you really want to kinesthetically involve them if you can. And one of the ways you can do that is just what I just did. Wherever you are, let me just ask you to do this. Take your hands and clasp them together like that. You can imagine asking an audience to do this. You can do this virtually. Just clasp your hands. Now look down at your hands and see which thumb is on top. Is it your left thumb or your right thumb? And a lot of times I'll say, okay, raise your hand with your left thumb, your right thumb, whatever. Then I said, now take your hands apart, and this time interlace your fingers back, but this time put the other thumb on top. Do the other interlace like that. And you can just hear the sound, even through a virtual screen, people saying, that's not the right way to do it, even though the audience is split about half and half as to whether or not they're right thumb on top or left thumb on top. And I segue out of that by saying something like this. You know what? There are a few things that are hardwired into you. You do not learn how to bring your hands together by watching your parents or watching your favorite teacher. You just didn't. You came born with a right way to feel, whether it's your right thumb on top or your left thumb on top. And when you do it the other way, you say, that's just completely wrong. And so, and then you can kind of pull them in and say, we all have some predispositions of some things. But the thing I want to talk with you about, and you say all of a sudden we've just gone to something that is more ambidextrous in their mind, you have to make your thoughts about some of these things. So that's just a little trick.
That's outstanding. I'm going to go to one more question, give you a chance for just any final things that you wanted to make sure that the group knew. Then I get to turn to Mike. So that's our few-minute rundown here. The question, and it really seems appropriate, it's regarding evaluating today's presentation. And before you answer, what will happen is that you'll get an opportunity to evaluate. Take that opportunity to evaluate. That will send me an email of what went well. You know, and I've usually had just 3 parts to an evaluation. One is what went well, and you would repeat it again. What didn't go so well, and what would you do about what didn't go so well? And so what would you recommend? So what went well, what didn't go so well, and what would you recommend? The 4th question that I use from time to time in evaluation is, was it worth your time? Which is really, really, you know, a loaded question, right? I mean, it's one question that, you know, gets right to it. Yep or nope, you know, and so that's a 4-question evaluation. And when you get the go-to webinar evaluation thing, send Ray something, do that. Take those 4 items. What went well, must repeat. What didn't go so well, how would you change it? And then finally, was it worth your time? Now, Randy, and you pressed on that, Randy, so I'm going to go to you, and Matt, I'll follow up with you. Go ahead. Evaluations.
Oh, I didn't know I pressed on anything, but I will add again.
Model, the fourth letter in model is evaluate.
Oh man, if I could have just remembered that.
I was listening.
Let me pick that figure. Well, I'm still interested in trying to help those folks more so than them helping me, although I do need your help. It really helps me if you give me 3 things that will make this presentation better. The other thing that I might be able to help them again is just if you email me, mail, M-A-I-L, at randyfrazier.com. I have a kind of pre-sorted set of attachments that I will send to you. I won't just send it to one place and everybody kind of feed off if they want to. If you care enough about that, just email me, mail at randyfrazier.com. And it may take me a day and a half, but I will email you back and give you those attachments, those links to other videos that are out there that do an excellent job. So yeah, evaluation is, if anything, I'm long in the tooth on that. You've got to have people tell you what needs to be fixed because you can't see it yourself.
Well, and Matt, you also pressed on this, and you gave us a format, right? Especially from those that you trust. So Matt, please, how would you evaluate?
What I'd say 2 things. One, first of all, this is the first time that I've done something like this virtually, and it looks like, unfortunately, COVID's going to be around for a while, so there's probably going to be more and more of these types of programs. So I would appreciate feedback because, as Randy said, I want to grow as a presenter and communicator. So if there are things that you think could make it better, please share that. But for you, the audience, again, it's just so important to make sure that you're growing and being able to solicit that feedback from friends or strangers. I mean, just being able to reach out to people you trust and really who are interested in seeing you improve is so very important. And Randy touched on it. I mean, you're not going to get better unless you're constantly seeking feedback. And sometimes it's not always the easiest to hear. We want to hear we're the greatest thing since sliced bread. But if you really want to get better, you have to look for ways to get that feedback. So would certainly encourage all of you in your growth to look for those opportunities.
Amen.
That's excellent. So for both of you, you know, usually when we get on the airplane and go back home or we're headed back to the airport, we think, dang, I wish I would have told them this, whatever that is, right? It's like that one thing that you just, oh my gosh, I just wish I would have told them. Randy, let's start with you. Did you have one of those pangs about, man, I just needed to say this and I forgot to, or didn't include it in your presentation or whatever it might be?
The words of Baba Dion, and that's why I ended with that. You know, like all the rest of you who are in conservation, you know, what really got me into this was the big paycheck, the easy hours, hardly any work to do. Yeah, right. What got you into this is because you care about the land, and the land does not vote. And so it's fundamentally important, and I suspect this is just as true for Matt. It's fundamentally important for us that we see you become the best thought leaders that there can be in any agency, because you speak literally for what we call America and the world.
Thanks so much.
Last thing I'll say to that, really nothing that I didn't share, but just to reiterate again, and Randy alluded to this too, that each of you have an individual story to tell. And as a legislator, former legislator, I remember it's the stories that constituents share that will impact the decisions of us going forward with potential legislation. So each of you engaged in conservation have a story. So now it's up to you to look for ways to better communicate that story to the public, to your officials, to those who can, the policy makers and changers is so important. So just have that passion, have that desire, and carry your story forward. And hopefully the training today can help you a little bit in how to best communicate that message for the most impactful outcomes.
Yes.
Well, I have a half a dozen worth of notebook pages of notes here from your two presentations, folks, and it would just so from a heartfelt thanks for answering the call to come to us today and do this webinar for our conservation folks. With that, then, I get to turn it over for closing comments from our Executive Director of NASCA, Mike Brown. Mike?
Thanks, Ray. And you know, we've all sat through presentations in life where at the end of the presentation you go, well, there's an hour of my life I'll never get back. And today's webinar was just the opposite. You know, we get so few of these real cherry moments, and guys, I can't thank you enough. You knocked it out of the park. In fact, through this 2-hour period, I only heard one thing that I disagreed with, and Randy, that was from one of the quotes you used, and the second line of that quote was, and we only love what we understand. And many of the folks out there know my wife Mary, and our love is really special. It's deep, it's unwavering, and there's never a moment that I don't love her with all of my heart. But there are many moments that I just don't quite understand. Okay. Having said that, I think it's important that all of us on today's webinar are reminded that I'm going to go back 80 years. A guy named Hugh Hammond Bennett got a lot of this started. And he did that not because he was the world's greatest soil scientist. Certainly he was skilled, but his real gift was he was a showman, and he was a speaker and a storyteller, and he knew how to get a message across. And in the last 80 years, we've done tremendous work on the landscape, and no one can question that. Where we have not done a good enough job is explaining the importance of that work. And these two gentlemen today are absolute professionals. Hopefully you can take what they shared with us today and use that to convey that message on a daily basis. And keep in mind, shameless endorsement here, guys, but these are professional speakers. They're both professional guns for hire. If you've got a venue where you really need to get a message across and you need a professional, I hope you don't mind me saying it, guys, they are available. So I will end things with that, Ray. And as always, I can't thank Ray Ledgerwood, our moderator, enough. Fantastic job, as always. Ray, I'll turn it back to you. Guys, thanks again.
Thanks, Mike. And just for those kudos, comments, or questions about where to get Randy and Matt's information, you could email Mike Brown there at the email address or phone call, or my phone number and phone call would be fine too. Happy to put that up on the screen also. So with that, then I'm going to do something unprecedented. I'm going to unleash everybody. I'm going to unmute everybody so they can give you a big old round of applause. Let's see if this will work here. So if you're muted out there, I want to give these guys a big old round of applause. Here we go. And we'll see if I can unmute all of you. Here it goes. All right, ready, set, work. Yay. All right, excellent. All right, that'll be the end of our webinar today. We were about 11 minutes over time, but I think it was well worth every minute. Folks, thanks so much for joining us today. and we'll see you down the road. Thanks again.
Thanks.